The job title alone is something that most of us would find overwhelming. As Executive Director of the UN's World Food Programme, Ertharin Cousin is head of the planet's largest humanitarian organisation. She's just visited Syria to check on the plight of hundreds of thousands of people displaced by the civil war, and also the Philippines to check on the devastating aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. Canberra was the latest stop on her tour of world capitals, where she held talks with Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. Ertharin Cousin, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for this opportunity.
Australia is cutting its aid budget. Do you accept the Australian government's argument that its priority has to be reducing debt and bringing the national budget back into surplus to ensure that whatever it does in the long term in terms of aid is sustainable?
Well, the reality is that many governments around the world are addressing their domestic challenges. But in light of that, WFP has seen an increase in our overarching budgets because governments around the world recognize the value of investing in WFP because we're an effective and efficient partner that provides value for money.
Now, clearly, while there are many tens of millions of people still suffering from chronic hunger around the world, there have been some extraordinary developments in recent years. China, for example, has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Does that make WFP's global challenge any easier, developments like that?
It makes the narrative so much easier to tell. When governments or individuals or critics suggest that you can't end hunger, China's a great example. 50 years ago, when WFP began our operations, China was our largest beneficiary country. And people said China would never feed itself. And we see the difference today. Korea was the exact same way. South Korea was a very big program for WFP. There were critics who suggested they'd never feed themselves. We know where South Korea is in the economic leadership today of the global community.
You have just been in the Philippines, where the scale of death and destruction as a consequence of Typhoon Haiyan is very grim indeed. What's the situation there now? What are the priorities?
Well, when I first visited the Philippines, the reality was there was no food available in large pockets of the country because of the effects of the typhoon. Now that situation has changed. Markets are reopened across most of the country. But what happens is in these situations, the poorest and the most vulnerable are often the hardest hit, and that's the case in the Philippines. So what we've done is switch from direct food interventions to providing vouchers and cash for work.
Syria is a particularly difficult challenge, not just getting the money needed to feed the hundreds of thousands of people displaced by the civil war, but also getting access to them. Are you getting any closer to providing people in need with what they require?
Well, right now, in January, our goal was to reach 4.25 million people. Because of the challenges of access that you note, we were only able to reach 3.8 million people. That's been the case for the past several months, where we are operating in all 14 governments across Syria, both in the regime-held area as well as in the opposition-held areas. But it's those besieged areas, the areas where the conflict and the fighting are ongoing, that we continue to have challenges reaching the people most in need. And in some of these cases, it's been 12 to 18 months where we have not regularly reached the population with food and with our partners with other non-food items.
And how much cooperation, if any, are you getting from the authorities, both government and opposition in Syria, to get that access and to get the supplies in?
Well, we meet with both government as well as opposition leadership because we're committed to maintaining the humanitarian principles of reaching people wherever they are. Because we deal with the consequences of failed politics, people who can't access the assistance that they need because of failed politics. And so when the negotiations begin to discuss one convoy, that's not good enough. What we need is to allow the unaffected access on a regular and ongoing basis to humanitarian actors to ensure that we can target distribute and monitor the needs of those who are affected by this conflict. And that's what we're not getting today from either side.
Ertharin Cousin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.